Alright guys, welcome to our video on navigation. This is, we're going to introduce a few new concepts here. We're going to introduce the new concept known as specificity. We're getting more specific with our selectors. And we're going to introduce pseudo classes when we work with our links here, because we're going to work on our navigation. So a couple of new things to talk about. So let's get to our files here. Got to open up my files first. This is starts to get fun because you get to start seeing the website come together a little bit more. So back to our index page here. So we're going to work on this div. Okay. Again, block level element, and I've given it an ID of navigation. All right. Inside of it, we have our unordered list with our list items for our navigation, and I've set up here in my navigation area my nav ID. Okay. And to start with, this is going to be similar to the header where the width is optional. I left the width in for the header in the last movie to show you the CSS box model again in action, so you guys wouldn't forget the padding adds to it. In this case, I'm going to leave it out, and I'm just going to add a height. Okay. And I happen to know my height is 30 pixels tall, so I'm going to go ahead and add that in. Again, where you would get the height for your specific design is up to you. Your layout might be completely different than mine. Okay, I happen to be getting it from Photoshop. You can get it from either Photoshop or from a drawn layout or whatever you like. And there's a little info button here that tells me how big my selection is, so I know it's 30 pixels high. Okay. So add that, and for my navigation bar here, I'm going to add a background image. Okay, yes, my navigation does have a background image. I could have left it as a plain color, that plain gray color, but I wanted to get a little bit more fancy. It's a good place to add kind of like a design element to your website, I always think. So I have an image here called nav_background, and it's a JPEG. Alright, and I'm going to go here to my Photoshop file to show you guys real quick, or my image rather. It's right here. Okay, so this image is only 13 pixels wide by 30 pixels tall. It doesn't matter how wide it is, it could have been 1 pixel wide. I just like to work with a little thicker image. It's easier to work with in Photoshop. This I'm getting from my layout. I kind of pulled it out of my layout in my Photoshop file and saved it as its own image, its own little JPEG. It's got a gradient from dark gray to light gray. It might be hard to see in the video. It's not just a flat gray image. I could have gone with a gray color for that, but I wanted to spice it up a little bit. Okay. And if you remember, background images repeat by default, right? And in this case, because this image is only 13 pixels wide, I need it to repeat across the bar here. So in this case, I'm not going to say no repeat. I'm going to say background repeat repeat dash X. I want it to repeat in the horizontal direction. Okay. So that's a good little start here. We got a height for the div. We have a background image for the div, and it repeats for this div right here. That's going to include everything inside of it. Okay, so I'm going to go take a quick peek here, open up my file, and let's see what we got so far. Computer is being slow. There we go. So there is my navigation bar. Okay, the gradient from dark gray to light gray. It stretches across the screen. It's repeating. Remember, that image is only 13 pixels wide, but I'm getting it to repeat across the width of my website. Okay, so it's a good way to save file size, right? Because it's the one small image rather than one large image all the way across. Okay. So next, I'm going to show you guys how to get a little bit more specific. It's called specificity within the CSS. Okay. I need to add some styles to these guys, my ULs, my LIs, and my A tags here. Okay. Because obviously, just adding that background to the nav itself isn't going to create a navigation bar. It's just the illusion of a navigation bar at this point. So I'm going to go back here to my CSS in a second. Let the video catch up. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and create a new selector here. And I'm going to start by saying that it's going to look like it's going to start with the same selector as before. You might say, well, why would I do that? Well, reason being is I'm going to actually apply styles to my list items here. Okay. So you could just say, well, why don't you just do what we've been doing before and just call out a list item and then apply your styles to it. Well, I could do this. However, I might have more than one set of list items on my website, right? I happen to be using them for my navigation, but what if I had other list items on my page, which I don't? If you did, all of the styles you applied to just that li tag on the CSS, if you left it like this, would apply to all of the list items on your page, and you probably don't want to do that. So here's a new concept. I'm adding a UL before my list item, and this is called specificity, okay? And you add a space between the two. So what I'm saying here is any li inside of a UL, apply these styles to. But that's still not specific enough, okay? Because I could have other unordered lists throughout my website. So what this says now is any list item inside of a UL, inside of a anything with an ID of nav, apply these styles to it, okay? So this gets us very specific. Now it's just the list items inside of my div with the nav ID, okay? So we're going to go ahead and start applying some styles to my list items. List items are block level items, right? They have their own margins, paddings, and content area, borders, all that good stuff, okay? So we're going to mess with these here in a second to create our navigation. So the first thing I'm going to add is font size, because I want to specify how big I want my font to be for my navigation. And if you remember, we started with a font size of 100% for the body, okay? Because I was going to be working with this. And I'm going to go ahead and set this in ems, relative value. So basically it says 80% of the value of 100%, which is 100% equals 16 pixels, if you remember right. So it's going to be smaller than 16 pixels, okay? And I'm going to give it a color. In this case, to stick with my color scheme, I'm going to stick with the color of the background I gave to the header. I want those to match. So I'm just going to copy and paste. Copy and paste is your best friend. Okay, so I want the blue here to match the blue here. Okay, that's what I'm trying to do there. It's just part of my color scheme. So I'm going to repeat those colors, and let's see what I got. And there you go. So it shrunk down. It took on the 0.8 em font size. And it didn't quite take on the color yet because those are the default colors for a link, right? Because these are actually wrapped with one more tag, the A tag. So I got to fix that next. Okay. But I need to do a couple more things before I move on to the actual link. We've talked about positioning. One of the position types we talked about was the float, where if you floated something either left or right, anything below it in the code would float around it. And I did show you an example of this in one of the videos. So what I want to do is float each individual li to the left. Okay, so that means the li after that will float up and take its place around it. Okay, it's going to bump up and shoot up next to it. So here's my li's. Right now they're stacked on top of each other, and if I refresh, now they floated up next to each other. Okay, and they still got the dots for the outline, right? The circles there. So we'll have to get rid of those, and obviously they're right next to each other. So I need to give them some space to breathe. So I'm going to give those margins. Now I'm working at the list item level. Remember, okay? So each list item now is going to have a margin of 5 pixels and top and bottom, and 20 pixels on left and right. Okay. So let's go ahead and save this and go take a look. And there we go. So on the bottom and on the top, there's 5 pixels of space, and to the left of this and to the right of this one, there's 20 pixels of space for each one. Okay. Now we got to get rid of that dot because that's not in my layout. Okay. And oh, it's a different browser. Let's close this. So here's a new property for you, and I think I've shown it to you once in another video actually. It's called list-style-type. Okay. And what this does is it controls what that dot looks like. You can use a few different properties here. There's actually quite a bit of them, but the most common ones are disk, which is I believe the default, which is what we're at now. There's circle. Okay, there's square. I'll show you what square looks like. So refresh and see how these turn into squares. Okay, you can actually make those custom images by just adding an image as a value here. So you can just do the same thing we did before with a URL and then the location of the file. So if we would have had a custom dot there, we could have added it here, but I don't. I actually don't have anything, so I'm going to say none. Okay, I want to get rid of that dot, and there we go. Okay. So now it's starting to look closer to what my layout looked like, but it's not quite there yet. The color isn't the same, right? These are the default colors for links. This is the default blue. It doesn't really match that blue, even though it looks like it might. And that's the purple, meaning I've visited that page already. Okay. So we got to get a little more specific here. Okay. So back to our CSS here. I'm going to create another specific selector, okay? And this reads the same as the one above, except now it says any anchor tag instead of an li, which I'll show you here. So what we have here is an anchor tag inside of an li, that's inside of a ul, that's inside of a div with an ID of nav, okay? If I go back to my CSS, that's exactly what this says. My a tag inside of my li, that's inside a ul, that's inside of a nav, okay? So I'm going to add some styles to that specific list, or that specific anchor. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to move the color down to the anchor, because the color doesn't matter on the list item itself, because I need to override the color for the actual link, okay? So there's a common mistake you might run into. I actually just did it, so I got to move this down. If I would have left it there, it wouldn't have overridden the link color, okay? If it would have just stayed the default blue and purple, so I got to move it down. And another one we've talked about in the past, which was text decoration. And if you remember, that was underline, overline, and line through were your options there, or none, okay? In this case, I want the default link to not have an underline, so I'm going to say none. When I refresh it, they've disappeared. And now that's looking pretty much like my layout. Okay, if I go back and look at this, that's pretty darn close. Okay, so I'm pretty happy with this. The other thing you might want to do here, though, is when people hover over this, you might want to let them know it's a button. Okay, so you might want to change the way it looks when people hover, so they know it's a button. So here we're going to get into a new concept known as pseudo classes. Okay, and this looks similar to what we just wrote, except for one thing. Okay, so again, I'm still messing with my links here, but I'm going to add something to the link. I'm going to add a colon, and the first pseudo link we're going to learn is hover. Okay, and what this is, just you're calling out a state for that anchor tag. So the first one we wrote was the default. Okay, now this is what happens when you hover over that anchor tag, is basically what this is saying. Okay, so when you hover over it, what I want it to do is change the text decoration from none, which is where the default is up there, what we set it to. So again, when you hover over it, this is the action. This is what the pseudo class does, the action for this anchor tag. I want it to have an underline when you hover over it. Okay, so I'll refresh this, and there we go. When I hover over my link now, I get the underline. So it's distinct now. People know that that's a button, that, you know, they'll probably click on it. Okay, that's a good one to add. There's a couple more you might want to add, although I wouldn't necessarily say they're mandatory to add. I would say hover for sure you want to add, unless for some reason your style dictates otherwise. Okay, the next one is known as active, and I'm just going to go ahead and copy and paste this for the last one. The last one is visited. Okay, so active is one you might not have heard of. Visited is pretty obvious, hover is pretty obvious. Active is when you actually click on the link, what happens. Okay, so when I click on this link, I want to change the color of it. I'm going to make it yellow so it's a good contrast here. Okay, and when I visit a site or a page once I've been visited, maybe I can change the color. Actually, I'm just going to do something. You probably don't want to do this for your own website, but this is just a good example, just so you can see the differences on each one. I'm going to say line through. I don't know why you would want to put a line through a visited page, unless stylistically it matched your site, but here we go. So I'm going to refresh this, and oh, there you go, the line through, because this is the page we're on. Okay, and that's visited. Okay, and now when I click on this, when I click only, it's the active state. I haven't clicked yet. There you go. It's yellow. Okay, so I'm going to click off this. That page doesn't exist yet, so I can't go to that page, but there you go. Active, it turned yellow. Okay, but you can apply any styles to any of these. Okay, so you can make things look however you want. Get creative with it, right? There is one more thing I want to add to this, but this video is getting a little long, so it'll come in the next video, and that's adding a background to either hover states or visited states or something like that, just because you can get some really cool effects with your navigation. But this is your basic navigation. Okay, feel free to copy mine and apply your colors and stuff, and there's still a bit more navigation to talk about, and I'll get to the next video.